Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Europe, Middle East, and Africa Cash Cycle Seminar, which many know as ICOS. For those of you who do not know, my name is Tom Mitchell, and I am the Vice President of Europe and Africa for Currency Research. I'm coming to you today from Scotland, and I'd like to extend a warm welcome to all of you joining us today from around the globe. There are a few hundred registered to participate in the session today, and in recent days, this number has been swelled by a large number of our industry colleagues joining from Asia. Given that it's nighttime for most of Asia and APAC, I'm not sure if you're all joining live or if you're planning maybe on watching on demand tomorrow morning, but you're all very welcome. And on that note, to help our presenters gauge and contextualize their discussions through the course of the event based on who is actually watching live, there is a poll just now asking which region of the world you are attending from, which is available at the top right-hand corner of your screens, indicated by the red dot. I'd be grateful if you'd respond to that. We will be running a variety of polls through this event, and we would be grateful for your participation. We don't track individual answers to these polls, only aggregate results. Almost unbelievably, this event is once again clearly taking place in a virtual format. We had understood from those who had signed up to join the planned in-person event in Amsterdam, supposed to be happening today, that travel on an organization level basis is still restricted. Unfortunately, we are virtual again this year, but I'm sure we're all looking forward to 2022 when it seems like most organizations expect to travel again. So let's quickly flash back to this time last year at the start of November 2020 and a few points that I opened the 2020 ICOS Europe event with. At that stage, lockdowns in many countries were ramping up again after some easing over the summer. A vaccine had been just developed, but it wasn't being deployed in more than a handful of countries, and even then it wasn't being deployed at scale. And our industry was in the midst of a massive increase in cash in circulation, with printers struggling to keep up with demand for fresh cash, but a collapse in transactional cash usage, with CITs struggling to stay open while most shops remain closed. While a number of commentators seized upon the rapid increase of cash in circulation as a clear indicator of cash's bright future, we saw that slightly differently. And actually, we thought that although a very welcome boost to the currency supply industry, due to lockdown, cash could be withdrawn, but it couldn't circulate. And we saw this as a potential disaster for the circulation sector as well as planners, because for the most part, the increase in cash in circulation was the higher value denominations not expected to circulate freely. Now that lockdowns in many places are easing, central banks are examining patterns. And I was very interested to understand recently the Central Bank of Russia has commented specifically that they're not seeing that extra cash that was issued coming back to them. And to be fair, there could be several reasons for this. Perhaps, for example, that cash is moving slowly as there are still some lockdown restrictions. Or, as we fear, perhaps that cash is static. But to a certain degree, only time will tell on that. I commented last year that my expectation was that cash use has probably stepped down to a lower, but still significant use level than pre-pandemic, and that the pandemic itself probably hasn't caused a longer-term drop in cash use levels in especially developed and Western economies. It's probably sped up an already occurring or expected to occur pattern. And that this step in itself, this step down, was caused by the ability to continue with making non-cash payments, whilst many retailers and the like actively restricted cash use over lockdowns. And I think mostly this is being borne out in the trends that we're seeing in many, but not all areas of the world as these trends are being reported now. A big change between now and a year ago, however, is that swathes of the industry have switched now from a crisis management mode back into forward planning mode. And the tone of debate and the focus of the debate that we're seeing across the industry has shifted. We see a lot more engagement by the authorities and regulators into topics such as access to cash. And although that as a topic remains a critical one, it is quietly being matched by an equally big problem, which is the ability to cash, or rather the inability of business to operate using cash in the absence of physical banking services. And equally, the speedy rise of non-banks into the area of provision of physical financial services. And some of these types of organizations we'll be hearing from later today. The focus, therefore, is increasingly on optimization, and ever more so, this means automation, along with right-sizing cash systems for current and anticipated demand, which is a really big challenge for many countries burdened with legacy distribution systems. But also, right-sizing and future demand must take into account the very real and important social and cultural aspects of individual countries and regions when upgrading circulation models. So things are changing, and things are changing fast, and it has never been more important for our industry to recognize change and to manage that change, to keep cash an efficient means of settlement readily available to all who require it. Equally, there has never been as important a time for us as an industry to come together and share information, experience, and best practice, and learn from individual successes for the benefit of all, sorry. So a couple of polls were just running in the sidelines there. We asked attendees joining one of our sessions over the summer a couple of questions, and it would be quite interesting just to compare the response from summer to the response now. So over the summer, we asked attendees of the Banknote Conference webinar, in your country of residence compared to 2020, the transactional use of cash in 21 will do what? Now, it looks like everybody attending today, apparently nearly 59% of people say that balance will stay about the same. That's about what we saw over the summer, actually. So perhaps trends not quite changing as much as was expected then. The other poll we asked over the summer was that in your country of residence compared to 2021, what do you think the transactional use of cash in 2022 will do? Of all of those attending today, over half thought that transactional cash use will grow. That is in stark comparison to, and I should point out, by the way, these results were captured about a minute ago as I was talking, so they may have been changing just now. That's in stark comparison to the figures we got over the summer, where only 26% of the 500 or 600 attendees on the Banknote webinar thought that cash use would grow next year. So very pleasing to see there's a little bit more optimism, at least in the attendees today, of what will things look like in 2022. So thank you for answering those polls. There will be a few more throughout the event. Before we launch into the agenda and hear from the Netherlands Bank, I would briefly like to introduce Currency Research CEO and President Jens Seidel to give you a little bit of a state of the industry update from our perspective. So Jens, over to you.
Thank you very much, Tom, and good morning, good evening, good afternoon to everybody. Thanks for joining us today. I am going to keep this really brief. I mostly wanted to thank everybody for staying with us and being so faithful to us and our virtual offerings over the last 18 months or so since this pandemic started in earnest in March last year. And we had some great successes with these virtual formats, but clearly we've seen its limitations as well. And I think we're all looking forward to going back to physical events, to getting back together in person and having these things happen that can't happen in this virtual environment that we're in. I think we all agree these are good to share knowledge for educational purposes, but these serendipitous encounters that you find at conferences, the networking, all of these kind of things that happen in person, I think are really difficult to replicate in this environment. So we're all looking forward to that, and we've got some really exciting and good things lined up again for next year, where we're hoping to return to something resembling normal in this post-pandemic world. We're going to start with the combined banknote and currency conference in Washington at the end of February next year, where we're also going to launch our new conference, the Digital Currency Conference, which is at the end of the Banknote and Currency Conference, with a new program that's focusing on the design and implementation aspects of digital currencies, including central bank digital currencies. We are also going to launch a new format we call the New Silk Road Payments and Cash Conference in Almaty, Kazakhstan, with the support of the National Bank there, where we're going to focus on how the planned changes on trade in this area are going to impact both the cash and the payments requirements for countries that are impacted by this initiative. And of course, we're going to return with our regional ICOS or cash cycle seminars, and also going to have our central bank payment conference again in person. So we're all hoping to see you there in person again next year. Until then, I look forward to the next couple of days and the really interesting program that Tom and our colleagues have curated for you. And with that, I'll give back to Tom. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jens. Yeah, it's a rather jam-packed 2022, which we are aware of. But you know, there's a lot of demand to get back to these face-to-face events from us, and we know from all of you watching. So we'll do our best to be able to cater to your desires and bring these events back to you. So, a couple of housekeeping notes just before we get into it. Sessions are being recorded, and the recordings will be made available for attendees to rewatch on demand shortly after the conference for the next few days. There will be details on how to rewatch content submitted at the end of each of the 2 days on this agenda. There will be polls scattered throughout both days. Please do answer them if you can. It helps our presenters orientate their discussions. And as I mentioned, this information is not tracked on an individual basis, but aggregated for trends, and you'll all be able to see the trends also. And please use the chat function on the virtual app to send questions for our presenters. We will answer as many questions in the Q&A sessions as we can, but please also make it clear to which presenter your question is directed. So, without further delay, let's get to our first speaker. And I am delighted to welcome to the virtual stage Olaf Schleipen, who is a board member at the Netherlands Bank, to talk to us about the Dutch cash system. We are expecting a little bit of time for Q&A at the end of Olaf's session, so please do feel free to post any questions into the chat box at the right-hand side of your screens, and we'll answer those that we are able to and we have time for. Olaf, thank you very much for your time this morning, and the virtual stage is yours.
Thank you very much. And let me start by saying also from Amsterdam, a very good day to everybody in this virtual conference. It's great to be here, unfortunately still virtually, and I would have loved to welcome you all here in Amsterdam. Frankly, looking outside the window, I will not show you now, but looking outside the window from a weather point of view, you're not missing anything. So maybe that's a little bit of a comfort. Let me start my introduction with let's say a personal note that once actually I bought a hotel in Amsterdam, and that hotel was right on the Kalverstraat, which is one of the most expensive streets in the city. And I paid for this hotel in cash. I'm not kidding you. Actually, I did that in a game called Monopoly. And I totally realized that the names of the streets are different, let's say, looking at the country version you are using. But those of you who know the Dutch version know that Kalverstraat is the most expensive street in the game. Now, in reality, we all know that large transactions like real estate are, of course, no longer done in cash, and definitely not in the Netherlands. And it's quite the opposite, actually. And in the Netherlands, the use of cash has declined steadily. 10 years ago, about 60% of all shopping was paid for in cash. And before the pandemic, that number had already dropped to 32%. And during the pandemic, the number even fell to, at a certain point, 13%, partially, by the way, due to misinformation on the contagion risk associated with the use of banknotes. And today, in a world that is with ups and downs recovering from the pandemic, number of retail cash by payments has risen again to a little over 20%. Now, personally, I must admit that I pay electronically most of the time, but I do still carry cash, just like every 4 out of 5 Dutch citizens. I carry it because it gives me some peace of mind. Just imagine there is an outage in the electronic payment system, and the cash in my wallet is something I can rely on then, and it's kind of a backup system. Others carry cash because it's just easy to use. And still, as I already mentioned, 20% of all transactions in stores in the Netherlands are done using cash. And some people, they carry cash because it gives them control over what they spend, helping them to stick to their budget. And still others prefer cash because it is public money, it's legal tender, and it offers them a level of privacy that electronic payments do not. And then there are those, of course, who prefer cash because it is the only way they feel comfortable making payments. For many of us, the digital era means a welcome step forward in payments option. But it would be wrong to assume that everyone in our society is fully familiar with electronic payments. For all these different reasons, and in line with the ECB position on this topic, the Dutch Central Bank wants to keep cash accessible, available, and affordable. And to contribute to an objective discussion on the future of cash, given also the decline of the use of cash, we have commissioned an independent study. The study is also published quite recently from McKinsey & Company. And it's a study on the future of the cash cycle in the Netherlands for the next 10 years. And 10 years because by then we assume that we will live in a less cash society, not necessarily a cashless society. The McKinsey study identifies 3 roles for cash. First, cash as a backup for electronic payments. Then cash as a necessary payments option for vulnerable people. And finally, cash as a general public means of payment. And these 3 roles determine the size and the cost of the cash infrastructure. As long as all 3 roles are relevant in our society, my view is that access to cash should remain at its current level. And going forward, we could actually translate the evolution of these 3 roles into a possible roadmap to a less cash society. And this translation implies that any changes to the cash infrastructure should be related to changes in the role of cash. Now, let me elaborate a little bit on this possible roadmap. Today, if for some reason you cannot pay electronically, your first alternative, I'll just already mention that, your backup will probably be cash. So you need access to cash. And that's also why in the Netherlands, Dutch Central Bank even advises you to always carry at least some cash. If banks consider the current cash infrastructure too costly, it is in their interest to develop alternative backups, secure and reliable backups that do not depend on the card networks, and that could be offline payments or QR codes. And only when these alternatives are widely accepted and used, the backup function of cash becomes less relevant. And only then could we move to a next phase on the roadmap, a phase in which the cash infrastructure decreases parallel to the decrease in the amount of cash people and the cash people need to have access to. But also in that phase, cash will still play a crucial role. The future of cash is a shared future, a future that is inclusive, and a future in which the way we organize payments does not exclude anyone simply because they find the digital era challenging or simply because they prefer to use a public means of payment. So also in this next phase, the access to cash should be ensured. However, to keep the use of cash efficient, changes to the cash cycle infrastructure might be necessary. For instance, by using modern, secure e-cash desks in stores. And these machines allow you to pay with banknotes, coins, and cards, or by reducing market inefficiencies. By this, I mean that with less cash use, the possibilities of a competitive market disappear. So instead of competition, we will need cooperation, also between cash handling companies like ATM companies and cash in transit companies. And this will effectively allow any remaining inefficiencies to be reduced. And obviously, the relevant authorities need to keep an eye on the risks of market abuse and overpricing in this non-competitive market. And this may require agreements or regulations. Finally, in the last phase, this can only happen, of course, when those in our society who depend the most on cash no longer do so. And this would be a phase in which cash as public money solely plays the role of a general means of payment and store value. This is still an important role for convertibility reasons and for trust in the monetary system. But it would mean that cash has become less important as a means of payment. In this last phase, cash can be viewed as a universal service. This would mean a bigger role for public institutions in safeguarding an accessible, available, and affordable future for cash. And the role of the market players would decline. As a result, the cost allocation would probably change accordingly. And I can also imagine that by this time, a digital euro may have been introduced as a new additional way to make central bank money available to the public. Now, I realize that by painting this picture of the future, a lot of questions arise. How do we achieve an adequate level of access to cash in each phase? How do we make sure that stores continue to accept cash and that they can deposit cash in a safe way? How do we keep cash affordable? These are all valid questions. So let me end my introduction by telling you what we are currently doing in the Netherlands to at least try to achieve this. Now, as I already mentioned, no matter what the future of cash will be, it will be a shared future. And that's what I think today, and that's what we thought 20 years ago when we set up the so-called National Forum on Payments. And this forum, that's chaired actually by the Dutch Central Bank, brings together banks, retail organizations, consumer organizations, and representatives of the elderly and the visually impaired. And these stakeholders discuss all topics related to payment services. On the topic of the future of cash, the idea of the forum is that a bottom-up, shared and formally agreed upon vision is preferred to impairing costly legislation. And it was always the plan to use the McKinsey study I just referred to as a starting point for a new and stronger agreement on the use of cash. So that is exactly what we are doing today. And we are currently in the process of setting up a covenant with all members of the National Forum on Payments based on the McKinsey study. A covenant for at least the next 5 years on how cash can continue to function at a level that fits with the first 2 phases I outlined before. The covenant will cover various aspects, including the accessibility of cash, for example, how many ATMs are needed, and where can retailers deposit their cash. It will concern the usability of cash, that is, can I still pay with it? And it will cover the affordability. In other words, how will we finance a cash infrastructure that mirrors our goal of an inclusive society? I'm hopeful that an agreement is imminent and that we won't need recourse to regulation. That would have been, or that will be, the alternative if the current discussions in the context of the forum will fail. Now, let me circle back to where I started, Monopoly. I guess many of you know this board game. And essentially, it's a winner-takes-all game. You acquire property, you charge rent from players who land on your property, and the game is over when all but the winner are bankrupt. And as an economist, I must admit that this has always made me slightly uncomfortable. But did you know that the game initially came with 2 sets of rules? And actually, in 1903, it's already a very old game, Elizabeth Meiji came up with what she called the landlord's game. And the idea was that you would start with the Monopoly rules, roughly like the rules we know them today, but during the game, players could vote to switch to the other set of rules. And this set was called the Prosperity rules. And under these rules, every player would win each time someone acquired property as a way to stimulate land or property taxation. That was actually behind it. And under the Prosperity rules, there would be not one sole winner. The game would simply end as soon as the player who started the poorest when the game switched had doubled the money with every player originally started. So when the game eventually got commercialized, that was in the 1930s, only the Monopoly set of rules was kept, and hence the well-known name. Now, why am I telling you this? The interesting thing is that a game that is actually about cash can have very different outcomes depending on the rules of the game. And a parallel to real life is, of course, not far-fetched. So the future of cash is preferably a future in which all stakeholders jointly decide on the rules of the game. And that's what we're trying to do at this point in time in the Netherlands in the forum. And to me, it's a future in which no one is left out, and it is a future that contributes to prosperity. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Olaf, thank you very much for a very fascinating insight into what's happening there in the Netherlands. And I think the key word to pick up on there is cooperation. And I think certainly having read through the McKinsey report, or at least the bits not in Dutch, that makes it very clear that there is a future for cooperation, and we see that also in the UK's previous access to cash review, where they were also bringing up some of these ideas of cooperation, and really that's how we're going to get to the future of the cash. So that's all very interesting there. A couple of just quick things to point out to our attendees just off the back of this is that the McKinsey report that Olaf is referring to is coming up in the next session after the ECB. So McKinsey themselves will be talking a little bit more in depth on that. So make sure that you stay around for that. It's going to be a very, very good look at the session. And also, Olaf, I think I felt the ears of about 200 cash people from around the world prick up when you mentioned the digital euro. We actually have a session on, not part of this conference, we have a session on that where Ulrich Binsel of the ECB is talking about the ECB's CBDC aspirations or otherwise coming up next Monday. So if anyone's interested in finding out more about that, head to the Central Bank Payments Conference and have a look at that. But Olaf, as I said, fantastic session. I'd just like to, I'm based in Scotland, and at the moment we have the COP21 summit going on, and we're told it's going to be great for climate change, as I've even just seen President Biden's motorcade of 25 SUVs barrel along the highway towards Glasgow from Edinburgh. But with all the work that DNB is doing into looking at the future of cash, etc., what considerations are there, should there be, towards sustainability from an environmental point of view? Is this something that you're actively looking into?
Yes, definitely. I think indeed I haven't touched upon it in my introduction, but yes, it's something we are definitely looking into. Of course, it's not something that we're doing on our own. When we talk about the production of banknotes, of course, it's a joint European effort to let's say we try to reduce, and we have already done that, but we try to continue to reduce our, let's say, CO2 footprint, but also in other ways, let's say the burden on the environment, but also in the processes that we are designing, that we are using in the Netherlands. We are actually, it's very important. We are at the moment, some of you probably notice that we are building a new cash center. We had our vaults and our cash center actually at our head office in Amsterdam, but we have decided to separate that function from the office function. So we're building a new cash center more in the middle of the country. And actually, we want to be that as sustainable as possible. And also the processes that we are, let's say, that we will introduce there in terms of handling of cash. It's also definitely something that we will take into account. So it's very high on our agenda, and it would almost let's say be another speech on the sustainability of cash. And of course, I think there's also here, and I think it's true for all of us, we need to there's a joint responsibility that we have when one uses cash and one compares it with electronic payments. I think that the latter being associated with being more sustainable. It's not always the case, by the way, but so I think we have a responsibility to make the use of cash more sustainable.
Yeah, no, it's a very interesting point that the anti-cash lobby are very, very keen to point out how sustainable payments are. And did I see the other day that China's mining of Bitcoin or something like that uses more energy than, was it even Iceland, or was it even some vast amount of energy? There's a real misconception about that going around, and actually I'll stop on that point briefly, because you also mentioned during your speech misinformation through the pandemic on cash. And that's something that we saw very, very clearly right from the start. There was a lot of misinformation being propagated by people by a small number of companies with some very, very deep pockets. Now, there's a bit of backwards and forwards in the cash industry as whose job is it to counter that kind of a misinformation. From the central bank's point of view, should it be the central bank's job to counter such misinformation and to actually promote or to re-describe the information and the various studies that were being done by central banks? Should the central bank be the one who's taking the lead on pushing back against that misinformation? And what more could the central banks have done?
Yeah, I mean, this is actually what central banks should do. First of all, it's our product, so to speak. We are issuing banknotes, and also as a public authority, I think we have that responsibility. And I think that's also, at least in Europe, what we have done. It took a little bit of time, but we have commissioned some, actually not only one piece of research, but several pieces of research looking into this, and it clearly showed that the risk of contagion, let's say with the COVID-19 virus, related to the use of banknotes is definitely not more than, let's say, touching any kind of object or whatever. Of course, it's important to avoid direct hand-to-hand contact, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you cannot use or you shouldn't use banknotes. But this is kind of a misconception that, kind of fed in the system, so to speak. And was one of the reasons, not the only one, but one of the reasons why the use of cash went down dramatically in a number of jurisdictions.
Yeah, no, and we saw that, and we would agree with that, and we saw that also in the UK. Olaf, I'm aware that the time is ticking by, and you have press the engagements later in the day. I think that's all the time we've got for questions just at the moment. But just again to say thank you very much for an enlightening session, and a special thank you to the Netherlands Bank in general for your continued support of this ICOS event, which was first supposed to be held in Amsterdam in March 2020, and then in November 2021 today. And it's a great shame it's not managed to come off in person, but we very much appreciate the support of you and your colleagues. So then, moving from a snapshot of a national cash system, looking at what's happening in the Netherlands, up to a regional cash system and looking what's going on across the Eurozone, I'm very pleased to welcome back to the virtual stage Joseph Rana from the European Central Bank, who will be giving us an update on cash trends and future implications in the Eurozone. Joseph, over to you.